My name is Judy. I'm 24 years old, and even though by any standard I'm a grown woman with a degree and a steady job at an insurance company, I still live at my parents' house, in the same room with the threadbare carpet and the flowered curtains I once chose when I was 15. It's not that I can't afford rent. I make enough money to rent and even save a little. It's just that I've never felt the need. I'm comfortable living under the same roof as my mom and dad, and there's a quiet honesty to that. I save money, and they don't feel abandoned. My younger sister, Christina, is completely different. She's 20, a sophomore in college in a neighboring town, an hour away, and only comes home for holidays and long breaks because her life revolves around campus, parties, and friends, and her parents pay for everything, sparing no penny. Tuition, housing, food, even pocket money. Everything is in her hands, as if it were a ready-made bow, and she doesn't even have to think about how she gets it. When I was studying, I knew the value of every dollar. Yes, I was lucky enough to snag a scholarship that covered most of my tuition, but the remaining 30% fell on my parents' shoulders, and I had to cover everything else myself: food, rent, textbooks, and even small living expenses. I toiled in the university bookstore until closing time, sorting stacks of textbooks and dusting the shelves. And on weekends, I worked part-time at a small diner where the floors were always sticky from spilled cola, and the smell of fried oil clung to my hair so badly that no shampoo could help. It was hard and not at all fun, but I learned to value money and not waste it on nonsense. And perhaps that's why today I don't have this endless desire to run away from my parents and live on my own. I know what it's like when every little thing costs effort. Mom and Dad were always hardworking and straightforward people. Dad managed a construction crew, Mom worked as a secretary at a law firm, and although we never lived in luxury, we had everything we needed and even a little more. Our own house and a small cottage by the river, where we'd spent our summers since childhood, where it smelled of old wood, mint, and river water. But this year, something seemed to snap. Dad's health began to fail. He couldn't go to work for several weeks, and Mom's hours were cut, and now bills were stacked on the table, and worry settled in my parents' eyes. I saw the tension in their faces when they thought I wasn't looking. Dad would look down at the floor, Mom would fiddle with the edge of the tablecloth, and all of it together seemed more terrifying than any words. One evening, I went down to get water and heard Mom quietly say to Dad, "Christina's rent is due in 3 months, and we don't have the savings we're used to. We can't afford it." Dad sat there, his face buried in his palm, rubbing his forehead. He always did that when the pressure of his thoughts was more than he could bear. Then Mom said, "What about the little house by the river? It's full of stuff we haven't used in ages." And then they hatched a plan: clean out the little house and sell everything they could turn into cash. They spent every weekend there for the next 2 months, sorting through the things they'd accumulated over the decades. I'd go with them and help them haul heavy cabinets and boxes out of dusty corners. And my heart sank as we dragged the old fishing boat my dad once used to teach me to hold a fishing rod outside, or as my mom wiped down the antique sideboard my grandmother had given me, with its worn handles and the smell of polished oak. But things were no longer memories. They were now turning into money. We gave the boat to our neighbor, Mr. Peterson, for $3,000. The dining room set went to another neighbor for $800, and my father's collection of tools, hammers, drills, old sets that he'd replaced with new ones over the years, were sold for $1,200. Some of the furniture was listed online, and I helped my mom photograph chairs and dressers to try to boost the price. And what was completely worthless, my dad silently took to the scrapyard. By the end of the summer, they'd sold almost everything. A fat envelope tightly stuffed with 20s, 50s, and 100s sat on the kitchen table, bringing the total to $15,000, exactly what it took to get Christina through her next school year. They hid the envelope in the closet behind a stack of sheets, as if it were the heart of the family, something they couldn't show anyone. Christina, meanwhile, knew nothing, living at her college, laughing with her friends, taking photos at parties, and confident that the money, as always, would fall into her lap. Last Tuesday morning, Dad called me into the kitchen, just before I was about to run out the door for work, and I immediately noticed how he clutched that very envelope, heavy and stuffed with bills, and his fingers trembled nervously, as if he were holding not money, but something alive, something that could break free and fly away. He placed it on the table between us and said in a quiet, almost tired voice, "Judy, do me a favor. This is all the money from the sale of the things in the river house. $15,000. You need to take it to the bank today and deposit it in our account." I took the envelope and it felt like it was dragging my arms down. Its weight made my chest go cold, and I exhaled. "Dad, this is too much to carry around." "Are you sure you want me to take it to work?" But he just shook his head, shielding his eyes with his hand. "I'd go myself, but I have meetings all day. Your mom is busy from morning until night, and you're the only one who can. You understand? We have no other choice." I looked at my watch, the hands mercilessly ticking, and said in a strangled voice, "Dad, I have a project deadline today. My boss said I can't leave, but tomorrow is my day off. I'll go to the bank first thing in the morning." He nodded, sighing heavily, and said, "Okay, just hide them somewhere overnight where no one will find them." I went up to my room looking around for a place, and suddenly all the familiar things, the dresser, the bookshelf, the closet, felt suspiciously flimsy, as if every crevice was waiting to betray me. I chose the top drawer of my desk, where my old notes and notebooks from college were strewn in a heap, and tucked the envelope under a pile of papers, trying to close it as tightly as possible, as if the paper trash could become armor. When I returned home that evening, tired and distracted, I walked through the front door and stopped as if I'd crashed into a wall. Christina was strolling around the living room, looking like she stepped out of a glossy magazine. Expensive jeans that fit her like they were custom made, a soft designer sweater, and boots that would have cost more than I make in a week. But what struck me most was her phone, a shiny, brand new model with a huge screen that shone like a jewel. "Christina," I said, setting my bag by the door, my voice trembling, "when did you get here? Where did you get all this from? Did you get a job or anything?" She laughed, and her laugh was scratchy, unpleasant, not at all like I was used to hearing. "My job? Are you crazy? I'm not stupid enough to be working some lousy part-time job like you did in college." Her words hit me like a whip, and a sticky, cold premonition rose up inside me, as if I already knew the answer, but couldn't bring myself to believe it. "Then how did you pay for all this?" I asked, feeling my heart begin to pound. She shrugged and, with that same insolent grin, said, "Oh, I just borrowed some money from a secret place." Imagine, I found a treasure chest, and in that moment, everything inside me collapsed. I didn't say another word. I simply took off and ran to my room, jumping 2 steps at a time, almost falling, my hands shaking so badly I could barely open the doorknob. I rushed to my desk, pulled out the top drawer, and began tossing old notebooks around like they were trash. The envelope was gone. I pulled out paper after paper, searching for any hint that it was stuck somewhere in the corner, but the drawer gaped empty, like a mockery, and a wild terror grew in my chest. I sat there, staring at the empty bottom, for a few seconds that stretched on like an eternity, and my hands shook so hard I couldn't control them anymore. The envelope was gone, vanished, as if it had never been there. I jumped up and ran back to the living room, my breath ragged as if I'd run, and everything was swimming before my eyes. Christina was still standing in front of the mirror, turning sideways, then half-turned, admiring her reflection, caressing her new phone as if it were her lover, and a smug smile shone on her face, making me want to scream. She was completely absorbed in the screen, taking selfies with a dozen different facial expressions, pursing her lips, tossing her hair, as if the whole world existed solely to capture her beauty. And I barely held back a scream, but my voice still broke. "Christina." She flinched and jerked her head up, fear flickering in her eyes, which was immediately replaced by irritation. "What's wrong?" she snapped, as if I'd violated her sacred ritual. I was about to blurt it out, but at that moment her phone vibrated, and she answered without even looking at me. Her voice had changed beyond recognition, soft, drawn out, sweet, like a girl eager to please. "Yes, baby." Did you get it? I sent you 10,000, just like I promised." And my blood ran cold when I heard it. She continued to purr into the phone. I know, you need money urgently for your debts. Don't worry, don't rush to pay it back. Just take care of what you need. $10,000. I snatched the phone from her hands, sharply, as if it were burning, and without thinking, hung up. My voice trembled, but the words came out like a gunshot. "Why did you take money from my room?" She rolled her eyes and let out a disdainful laugh. "Oh, please, Judy. I came into your room to borrow your charger. Mine was broken. I didn't find the charger, but I did find an envelope you just shoved into the drawer." I took a step toward her, my hands shaking. "You just took $15,000 that didn't belong to you? Do you understand what that was?" She shrugged and said calmly, as if she were talking about a couple of coins, "If money is lying around the house, it's family money. And I'm family. I just found a good use for it instead of letting it gather dust." I was so stunned by her impudence that I was momentarily speechless, the air in my throat forming a lump. Meanwhile, she picked up her brand new phone, pointed the camera at my face, and snapped a photo. "You should only see yourself now," she laughed. "You look like a madman." "It's hilarious. Maybe next time you shouldn't leave money scattered around the house if you don't want someone using it." And then the front door clicked, and footsteps sounded in the hallway. Mom and Dad had returned from work. Dad walked in first, frowning, keys in hand, and I immediately sensed the tension in the air. "What's going on here?" His voice was firm but alarmed. I couldn't resist blurting it out, too loudly, almost shrieking. "Christina took the money from my room and spent it all." Mom froze in the doorway, her face pale, her lips trembling. "What?" "Judy, that's not funny. Don't joke like that," she said, her voice pleading, as if she were trying to push the terrifying thought away. "I'm not joking, Mom," I blurted out, pointing at my sister. "Look at what she's wearing. Look at those bags on the couch. They're full of new clothes. Even the tags are still on. And I just heard her say on the phone that she sent someone $10,000. Christina paled noticeably, but kept her expression composed, though the confidence in her voice had vanished. "Whose money was that?" Dad tensed, his cheeks flushed red, a sign of trouble. "It was the money from the country house," he said, breathing heavily. "We sold everything. The boat, the furniture, the tools. We worked every Saturday and Sunday for 2 months to save up that $15,000. It was money for your education, Christina." She widened her eyes, genuinely shocked, as if realizing the magnitude for the first time, and whispered, "Wait, what? You sold things from the house?" Mom took a step forward, her hands shaking, her voice breaking. "We sold the boat, all the old furniture, Dad's tools, everything we could get rid of. We couldn't afford to pay for your next year of college any other way." And at that moment, Christina broke down. She went berserk, started screaming, pointing her finger at me, her voice hysterical. "I didn't take anything. It was all her fault. Judy spent the money herself, and now she's trying to blame it on me. She's lying." I turned to my parents desperately, my voice breaking. "How much do you think she could have spent on just the clothes she's wearing now? Look at these bags. Thousands of dollars in clothes, the tags still attached." Dad walked over to the bags and started pulling things out, and something bitter stuck in my throat as I watched designer jeans, expensive tops, and, like the final nail in the coffin, the leather jacket, the very one that, by my calculations, cost more than his weekly salary, emerge from the bag one by one. I prepared to continue because the rest of the list I'd heard on the phone was already churning and flaring in my chest. "She said she sent $10,000 today," I said, my voice shaking violently, and Christina screamed, accusing me of lying and shouting that I was making it all up. I grabbed the phone and, without thinking, said, "Okay, I'll call the police now. I'll tell them about stealing the $15,000. They'll be able to track all your purchases through the store's cameras and bank transactions to figure out where the money went." And at that moment, Christina's face twisted. She burst into tears, and her tears were no longer the simpering, fake sadness I'd seen before, but real, piercing. Because finally the words burst out. Okay, I took it. But I thought it was Beth's savings. I thought it was money she saved from work. And I looked at her as if the whole house was about to fall apart, because there was no room for softness left in my voice. So you thought my money was just coming to you. You thought you could steal from me and get away with it. Even Mom and Dad were stunned by her confession, and Dad's voice, usually warm and patient, became sharp and frightening. Quiet. Christina, that was money for your college education. We don't have any more savings for you. What were you even thinking? Christina sobbed even louder, and through her sobs came a sharp, I sent it to Derek, my boyfriend. He had gambling debts. They threatened him. He promised to pay it back someday. And that someday struck us like a bow on a string, causing Mom to exclaim loudly and ask that very question that seared the air. What else did you spend? And Christina, through her sobs, began to rattle off a list that took my dad and me by surprise. I took friends to that expensive restaurant downtown. We spent about $1,500. And I watched as Mom slowly sat down on the sofa, all her fatigue and usual readiness to protect her youngest daughter turning into disappointment and cruel resentment. I always protected you, Christina. Always when Judy complained that you were taking her things, I asked her to share. When you had problems at school, I looked for excuses. But today, you crossed all boundaries. And her voice shook so much that the words broke in mid-sentence. Christina, unable to bear it any longer, ran into her room and slammed the door. The sound echoed dully throughout the house, making us all freeze. Because despite her hysteria, everything was already clear. Dinner that night had turned into the most awkward meal ever, one thick with layers of silence. We ate, and every sound of a fork on a plate felt like an accusation. And when Dad finally put his fork down and looked straight at Christina, his eyes held a decision, as stern as a sentence. Your mother and I have made a decision. We will not demand that you return the money you stole. A small glimmer of hope hung in the room, suddenly flickering across her face, but I knew it was only a semblance of mercy, because Dad continued without hesitation. However, starting next semester, you will take a year off from school. You will find a job and earn your own money. We won't give you any more money for tuition or any other perks. And when she cried out that she couldn't earn that much and that tuition was expensive, Dad said so firmly that the house smelled of iron for a second. You should have thought about this before handing over $15,000. And that was the final decision, not subject to discussion. Christina began to cry again, and her tears were as full of fear as they were of bitter reality. And I couldn't help but feel something warm and nasty creeping inside me. It wasn't joy at someone else's misfortune, but satisfaction, cold and clear, because finally she would have to face the true consequences of her actions. And in this harsh lesson, there was something that, after years of patience and petty compromises, I had long been waiting for. That night, around midnight, I heard a soft knock on my bedroom door, and my heart sank, because in the silence of the house, the sound was so insistent and pitiful, as if someone was standing behind the door, empty-handed and full-eyed. I opened it slightly, and there was Christina, her face full of everything, weariness, anger, hopelessness, but most of all, a despair that made me feel uneasy. "Judy, please, I need to ask you something," she whispered, turning around, as if afraid her parents would hear her footsteps in the hallway. "What do you need?" I kept my voice deliberately cold, but inside I already knew what was coming. "Could you lend me $15,000? I promise I'll pay it back as soon as I graduate and find a real job. You understand how important college is to me, please." And at that moment, I couldn't believe my ears, because it sounded not just like a request, but like a slap in the face after everything that had happened today. I stared at her in amazement, and the words just came out of my mouth. "Are you seriously asking me for money after what you did today? After you fleeced our parents and ruined all their plans?" She immediately flared up. "Come on, Judy. We're sisters. Family helps family, right? But I couldn't even listen to that tone anymore, these eternal manipulations. No, Christina. Absolutely not. You made your choice today, I said quietly, but in a way that made her back off. She stood there for a moment, a hurt expression on her face, then turned abruptly and ran into her room, slamming the door so hard it rattled my windows. I lay in bed trying to fall asleep, but instead, memories began to unwind in my head, like an old film reel, with Christina playing the same role over and over again. I recalled how, as a child, she'd steal my toys without asking, break them, or hide them until I cried at night. In high school, she'd take my clothes, return them torn or dirty, and sometimes not return them at all. I remembered how money would disappear from my piggy bank when I was saving for something special, and every time I complained to Mom and Dad, they'd repeat the same old refrain. "She's your little sister, Judy. She doesn't mean you any harm. You should share. She probably needed it for something important." I lay there and thought, what if she had stolen my savings instead of theirs? Wouldn't my parents justify her again? Wouldn't they say the same words I'd heard my whole life? The next morning at breakfast, Christina decided to change her tack. She came downstairs slowly, looking like a repentant girl, and her voice was quiet, as if she'd rehearsed it all night. "I'm so sorry about yesterday. I know I did the wrong thing, and I promise I'll never do it again." But Dad didn't even look up from his coffee mug. His voice was cold and cutting. "Apologizing won't change our decision. Christina, you won't get a penny from us anymore for tuition or rent." She tried to object, her voice trembling. "But there's no way I can earn enough to pay for everything myself." And then Dad looked at her in a way that sent a chill down my spine. "You should have thought about that before spending our money. This conversation is over. Later that morning, Christina put on quite a show. She stomped and stomped as she dragged clothes around her room, throwing them into suitcases so that every sound could be heard below, like hammer blows. Then I heard the suitcases rattling up the stairs and hitting the banisters. And there she was, standing at the front door, flushed and out of breath, her face full of theatrical grief. "Okay," she announced loudly so everyone could hear. "If you don't want me here, I'll go live somewhere where people will actually care about me." And turning, she walked out, leaving behind a void and the slam of a door. We didn't hear a word from her that day. The house was strangely quiet, as if the air had been sucked out of it along with her screams and drama. But the next day, the phone rang in the living room, and my mother answered, her face pale, and then handed it to me. It was Grandma, her voice trembling and worried. "Judy, what happened?" "Christina called me in tears and said you kicked her out of the house and aren't letting her finish college. She said you're the reason she's in trouble with her parents." The phone trembled in my hands, and I immediately handed it to Dad, because I knew only he could explain everything without unnecessary emotion. He calmly but firmly told Grandma everything as it happened, every detail, leaving no room for her fairy tales. When he finished, there was a long silence on the other end, and only then did Grandma exhale heavily. "Oh my God, I had no idea." Her voice changed, firmer, and she added, "Christina made it look like you were all being unfair to her. She asked me for money for her studies." Dad asked evenly, "And what did you tell her?" Grandma sighed. "I said I'd think about it, but now that I've heard the truth, I won't give her a penny." In fact, that very evening after my conversation with Grandma, I went through the house checking drawers, cabinets, and even the pantry, because I couldn't shake the feeling that Christina might have taken something else when she visited last month, and the thought made me angry and shaky with helplessness. But it soon became clear that my worries were justified. Over the next few days, the phone in our house literally rang non-stop, ringing in turn, and each call seemed to be a new chapter in the same story. First, Aunt Sarah called, her voice halting as she asked why Christina had suddenly asked her for a loan, insisting that her parents had abandoned her. Then Uncle Mike informed her that Christina had come to him in person, stood on his doorstep with the face of a poor student, and told a touching story about how she urgently needed help with her college fees. A day later, Jennifer's cousin called, distraught. Christina had asked her to co-sign her student loans, insisting that she had no one closer and that only Jennifer could save her. And each time, Mom or Dad had to go over everything again and again, explaining the truth, and each time we heard the same sigh of horror and disappointment on the other end of the line. Her relatives were shocked and, of course, refused Christina. A week later, when her circle of help had closed, and apparently there was no one left to turn to with complaints and fairy tales, Christina returned home alone. She walked into the living room slowly, as if her legs were leaden, and sank into a chair as if she were carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. "I went to everyone," she said, her voice hoarse and broken. "Everyone from my family, my friends from college, even some of Derek's friends. No one helped me." Mom looked at her carefully and replied dryly, "Are you surprised?" Christina swallowed nervously and continued, "Listen, I'll do what Dad wants. I'll take a year off and work, but can I at least stay here so I don't have to pay rent? If I have to rent an apartment, I'll never be able to save for college." Mom and Dad exchanged glances, that silent conversation with their eyes that always spoke louder than words. Finally, Dad said slowly and clearly, "You can stay, but you will follow our rules and not ask us for money for anything." 2 months had passed since all this drama, and I myself felt it was time to take a step forward. I found a nice one-bedroom apartment about 20 minutes from my parents' house, and over the course of one weekend, packed up and moved everything in. It was incredibly nice to finally be in my own space, where everything belonged solely to me and where I didn't have to deal with the daily tension that had hung in the air at home since the money incident. I furnished the apartment my way and enjoyed the silence, even when it seemed resonant. A few weeks later, Mom called me and shared news about Christina. She'd gotten a job as a waitress at a family restaurant downtown, working long hours, sometimes too much, coming home late and falling exhausted into bed, giving Mom and Dad her entire paycheck each week and keeping only tips for small change. I listened and couldn't hide my surprise. Honestly, I expected her to lose it again, run away, or find a way to get out of it. But instead, she actually worked. And to my own surprise, I felt relieved, even happy that she was finally learning responsibility. 2 months later, one Sunday, I decided to stop by my parents' house and see for myself how Christina was doing. When I walked into the house and saw her, I barely recognized her. The girl who used to walk around the house with her head held high in designer jeans, her hair perfectly styled, and a phone in her hand that cost more than my monthly salary, now sat at the kitchen table in plain jeans and a regular t-shirt, without makeup, eyelash extensions, or a manicure. She looked tired, yes, very tired, but at the same time more genuine than I had seen her in years. "Hi, Christina," I said, sitting down across from her, and for the first time, there was no anger or mistrust in my voice, only cautious warmth. "How's work?" She sighed heavily, rubbed her forehead, and said, "It's tough. My legs hurt all the time, and some of the customers are incredibly rude, but I'm coping, and it's getting a little easier." At that moment, Mom walked into the kitchen, hugged me, and said with a smile, "Judy, you're just in time." I was just about to tell Christina about the new account we opened for her. "What account?" I asked, looking warily between Mom and Christina. Dad joined us in the kitchen, still holding his ever-present coffee mug, and said in a calm voice in which I immediately heard the steely determination he displayed only in the most serious situations, "We opened a special savings account for Christina." He explained that every week when Christina brought them their paycheck, they put the entire amount into this account, leaving her only tips for everyday expenses. I glanced at my sister and she nodded, as if confirming his words, adding quietly, almost apologetically, "The tips aren't much. Well, maybe $40 or $50 a week." Then she admitted that she had to sell her new phone and buy an old, cheap one just to get by. I noticed that she was indeed holding an old flip phone, the same model they'd used 10 years ago, and it seemed almost ridiculous, especially considering the shiny, expensive smartphone she'd once bought with her parents' money. Mom sighed and explained, "We told Christina she can't touch the money in this account for a whole year." After 12 months, we'll give her access, and then she can decide for herself what she wants to do." "What do you mean, decide what to do?" I asked, because I immediately heard that tone my parents used to hide their true intentions. Dad's face turned stern and he said, "She can either use the money to go back to college or give it to her boyfriend. But if she chooses her boyfriend, she'll leave this house forever." I looked at Christina and frankly expected to see a protest or at least a flash of irritation, but she just nodded as if she understood the rules of the game and resigned herself to it. Mom suddenly lowered her voice, even though there were only us in the room, and said, "Speaking of Derek, I heard Christina talking to him on the phone last week. He asked her for money again." I turned to my sister and asked directly, "And what did you tell him?" Christina lowered her eyes and answered barely audibly, "I told him I don't have money to give him." Then, after a slight pause, she added, "He got angry. He said I was selfish. He keeps saying that if I loved him, I'd find a way to help him with his debts." "What do you think about that?" I asked. A long pause hung between us, and only after a few seconds did Christina exhale. "I think Derek only loves me when I can give him something." 4 months passed, and one day my mother called me, her voice excited, but also bitter. Christina broke up with Derek. She explained that he continued to pressure her, demanding money even after she honestly admitted she couldn't access the account. When she refused to ask us, he started being rude and turning into a stranger. "Good for you," I said into the phone, and it wasn't just empty words of support. I was genuinely proud of her decision. Then I couldn't resist asking, "Did he at least pay back the $10,000? Mom laughed, but it was a bitter laugh, filled with all the weariness of recent years. "Of course not." Christina finally understood that he never intended to return it. He told her that money should be shared freely between people who love each other, and demanding it back was like a sign of mistrust. I felt angry again, feeling my insides tighten at the thought of that money, but at the same time I felt genuine pride for Christina, who had finally seen Derek without his masks. And then December came, and on her 21st birthday, I went to the bank myself, withdrew $500 in cash, put it in a card, and brought it to her for her celebratory dinner at her parents'. When she opened the card and saw the money, she sat silently for a long time, looking at the bills, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, and there was something new, something genuine in that thank you. But what she did next shook me to the core. Instead of keeping the money for herself, Christina handed it to Dad and said, "Can you put this on my account too?" "I want to save every penny I can." Dad looked as stunned as I did, but he nodded and took the money. And when Christina left the room, the three of us, my parents and I, sat down at the table, and the conversation that ensued was completely different than before. It was our first truly honest conversation in many years, and I still remember how the silence in the kitchen seemed to tremble with the weight of the words spoken when Mom finally admitted, "We messed everything up with Christina. We spoiled her terribly. We always made excuses for her behavior and never made her face the consequences." Dad nodded and added, "Remember how she took money from Judy's piggy bank? We told Judy to stop complaining because Christina was little. But really, we taught her that you can take whatever you want and get away with it." I looked at them and said, trying to sound grateful as well as bitter, "I'm glad you finally realized that. But I'm even happier that you're making amends now, even if it's at the cost of such hard lessons that have cost us all dearly." Meanwhile, my parents were indeed working on making amends, not only for their mistakes in parenting, but also for what symbolized a new stage for them. They bought an old country house and spent all their free time there, paintbrush in hand, painting the gray, peeling walls, in the garden, clearing away weeds, or choosing furniture that could bring the house back to life. And when they invited Christina and me to spend a week there together that summer, I initially thought it was another attempt to mend cracks that could no longer be mended. But then I realized that this is exactly what a family's true desire to start anew looks like. The house had truly changed, as if it had been washed clean of the past. The white walls gleamed, the windows were clean, and sunlight poured through them, falling differently on the new furniture they'd bought to replace what they'd once had to sell to pay off Christina's debts and her frantic purchases. And so, on the third evening, my sister and I were sitting on the veranda, looking out at the river, where the setting sun cast crimson streaks across the water. And for the first time in a long time, we were talking as if we truly were sisters, not enemies, forever settling grievances. Christina suddenly spoke, and her voice was serious, completely different from the petulant tone I'd heard from her almost my entire life. You know, I never understood money before, but now I know how hard it is to earn even $50. When I see something for $100, I think, that's 2 days' work, 2 days of aching legs, heavy trays, and rude customers. I nodded and said, "That's a good way to think about it." She lowered her head and added, almost in a whisper, "I think about that 15,000 all the time, about how many hours Mom and Dad worked to earn it, and I just gave it away like it was nothing." There was a tremor in her voice, and for the first time I believed these were real words, not a mask for yet another manipulation. "It must have been months and months of work for them," she continued. I confirmed. "They worked overtime and weekends to save up that money." "I wish I could take it all back," Christina said, tears glistening on her cheeks. "All of it. The money, the way I treated you, all my antics." I placed my hand on hers and quietly replied, "You can't take it all back, but you can make sure you never do it again." She jerked her head up and said with unexpected firmness, "I won't. I swear I won't." I looked at her in the rays of the setting sun, and in that moment she seemed different, not just because she was now wearing cheap jeans and no makeup, but because there was a depth in her eyes that had previously been hidden by a layer of superficial glitz and lies. She looked as if she had finally understood that actions have consequences, and that they are what make a person mature. "Christina," I said, my chest tightening with unexpected tenderness, "I'm so proud of how hard you work." She smiled, and it was that smile that held no pretense, the first genuine smile I'd seen hers in months. "Thank you, Judy," she replied. "It really means a lot to me." And as we sat together on the veranda, listening to the lapping of the river and the chirping of the evening crickets, I suddenly realized that perhaps this whole terrible story of broken trust, stolen money, screams and tears was exactly what needed to happen for us all to finally see each other without illusions. It forced each of us, Mom, Dad, me, Christina, to confront the truth we'd been trying to avoid for so long. And maybe, just maybe, because of it, we'll all be better people one day.